Today, we're going to be starting our first video on the AP Psychology series. So today we're going to look at the neurons and the lobes. In particular, we're going to look at the structure of the neuron, essentially what makes up the neuron, and also how do the lobes in particular give us certain functions. So the lobes gives us functions, and in particular we're looking at how it gives us certain functions, correct? So with that being said, let's get into it. The first few slides are going to look at, again, the neuron structure. I'm going to analyze it, break it down for you guys. And the next slides, or the next slide I should say, is going to look at the lobes. We're going to analyze the specific parts of the brain here and where the lobes are located across those parts of the brain. And we're going to look at their functions as well. So let's get into it. All right. So here is a diagram of the neuron structure. Kind of a lot going on here, but of course, let's break it down. So the first thing I want you guys to consider is that the neuron is basically known as a nerve cell. So if we kind of bring this here, a neuron is also known as a nerve cell, okay? So a neuron is a nerve cell. If you think about it, or if someone tells you, hey, nerve cell, just recognize that it's also known as a neuron. So it's another way you can call it. The first thing, of course, with the neuron structure is, since it is known as a nerve cell, as we denoted it, right? The reason why we can call it a nerve cell is because if you see this center here, and there's a label called a nucleus. All cells have a nucleus, correct? And this is literally what is known as a cell body. So this center piece here, where there's a nucleus labeled, and the reason why we call this entire neuron a nerve cell is because this part in particular is known as the cell body. So that is a cell body right there. Okay. So we kind of get that. Okay, we know that the neuron is a nerve cell. It is a cell pretty much because it has a nucleus. But so what are these branches here? You see here there's a couple of branches here. There's a couple of branches here. And then there's a really long branch in the middle. What are those? So first of all, these branches here, these guys, and you can kind of just label them here. These are known as dendrites, okay? Dendrites. Okay, so these branches here are known as dendrites, and what they do is that they receive the signal from another neuron. So through neurotransmitters, we'll take a look at that in the next slide, but really what these dendrites do is that they receive the signal from another neuron, another message from the other neuron. And what it does is that the signal goes through this cell body here, and then it allows the neuron to fire. And when this neuron fires, it then passes through here to the smaller branches located at the bottom here. These are known as axon terminals. But really just know that with the dendrites, they receive this incoming signals from the other neuron. When they speak to each other, when neurons speak to each other, when they're connected, the dendrites receive those signals. So we covered the dendrites, these branches here, the top branches, the cell body, which is this middle part here where the nucleus is labeled. And now let's take a look at this middle longer branch here. So this middle longer branch, which is known as the axon, is basically what relays the signal from the cell body. Really, when the signal is transmitted, it goes across the axon, this middle branch, of course, as I mentioned, to the axon terminals. Okay, that makes sense. But what are these structures here? What are these kind of cushioning blue parts of the axon? These are known what are called, or these are what are known as myelin sheaths. And the function of these blue parts here is to cushion the axon. So not only to cushion the axon and protect it as a layer of protection, but it also enhances the signal of the neuron. So as the signal is being relayed through this axon here, the myelin sheaths allow it to be, essentially, I guess you could think of it as, not only in terms of enhancement, to be signaled quicker, or to be relayed quicker, I should say. So the axon, or the myelin sheaths that are part of the axon here and cushioning the axon, allow the signal to travel faster in order to reach these axon terminals much quicker. So basically, again, it enhances the signal's travel time, in other words. And then, as I mentioned, speaking of axon terminals, these are what These are the branches where, we can take that signal and transmit it to the other neuron across the synapse, across the gap where two neurons essentially they will meet. But keep in mind that from the axon, the signal then reaches kind of a dead end, if you can think of it. The axon terminals are the dead end for the signal, where the message will be transmitted to the next neuron. All right. So just kind of a quick recap. Cell body here is the middle. Dendrites are these top branches. Myelin sheaths are these cushioning parts here. And keep in mind the myelin sheaths cushion the neuron and also enhance the signal. And then the bottom branches here are the axon terminals, where the signal then will be transmitted to the next neuron. Cool. So that is basically neuron structure. All you need to know in AP psychology about the neuron in terms of the structures are all these things here, as I broke it down here. That's the structure of the neuron. Okay. So we know what the structure of the neuron is, but what makes the neuron fire? That's the key. What makes the neuron able to shoot its signal and to transmit its signal? Well, the first thing we have to consider is that there is a certain threshold, okay? Now this threshold word is basically the amount of energy, or the amount of, I guess you could say, stimuli required for the neuron to fire. So when we reach a certain amount of energy or level of stimuli, the neuron basically charges up, and then boom, it basically hits that signal across the axon to the terminal branches. And then when this after the threshold is reached, after the neuron fires, and when the threshold is reached, I should have mentioned this is known as the action potential. Basically when the neuron is ready to fire. After it does, there's a certain of inactivity, or a period of the neuron where it does really nothing. It kind of rests, as you can see in this graph. This is known as the refractory period, okay? So the refractory period, again, is just the resting state of the neuron here. It just doesn't do anything, it just kind of regains its energy for another period of action potential before it fires again. So just keep in mind that there is a threshold. The threshold is the amount of energy and stimuli required for the neuron to fire. And when that threshold is reached, that is known as the action potential. And after it fires, there is a certain period of time where it just does nothing. And that is known as the refractory period, where the neuron just kind of rests. Okay, cool. So we went over, of course, the neuron structure, and we went over what makes the neuron fire. So our next slide will take us into the neuron pathway. So if you remember, I talked about the terminal branches, right? And I mentioned there was an area of gap between the neurons. So speaking of the terminal branches, these are the terminal branches, right? I'll just say terminal here, but these are the terminal branches, right? These were the dendrites, of course, the axon, and then again, as I mentioned, terminal branches. Really, the two neurons here, you see here there's a gap, right? There's a space, a small space, but they're not touching each other necessarily. And that space in between two neurons is called the synapse. So keep that in mind. But okay, if they're not touching each other, then really, how does the signal get to the other neuron? So from one neuron to the next, how is the signal relayed to the other one? That is a good question. And the way that works is through neurotransmitters. I'm not going to write neurotransmitters because I'm probably going to write it not so neatly. But really what I want you guys to consider here is that these neurotransmitters, I can write it here, are just chemical messengers. So think of these kind of circular objects I drew here. They're the neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are released from the terminal branches. So basically you can think of it as, if I erase these here, so these neurotransmitters are released. So these are the dots here. The neurotransmitters are released from the terminal branches, and the way the signal is reached to the other neuron is through reception. So what I mean by that is these dendrites here, they have kind of these spaces, right? I'm drawing these kind of branches here to show you guys that these neurotransmitters, they can fit into these spaces. So when they fit in, then the signal is relayed to the cell body. So basically, there's a connection between the chemical messengers, neurotransmitters, and the dendrites. When it receives the signals, we have called these are called receptors, right? So these branches here are known as receptors. Okay, and these receptors, as I mentioned, and you probably guys kind of guess it now, they receive or they attach to these neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters, when they attach to these receptors, relay the signal to the cell body, to the other neuron, which can then be traveled down through the axon, then to the terminal branches to go through that process again. So really think of it as the two neurons are not necessarily connected. There's a synapse, a gap between them, but the way that signal from that previous neuron is reached to the other one is through chemical messengers known as neurotransmitters. And when those neurotransmitters move across the synapse, they are received. They are received by these receptors, these branches here that I kind of drew out here. And when those chemical messengers bind to the receptors, so when they bind to the receptors in the dendrites, then that signal is relayed to the cell body and across the axon and so on. So keep that in mind. That is how the neuron pathway, really how neurons actually speak to each other, how they are connected, is basically through chemical messengers that are then received by the other neuron. All right. Now the last thing I wanted to talk about are the lobes of the brain, right? So the lobes of the brain. So you can see here we have a frontal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, cerebrum, temporal. Cerebrum is just the pink area here that covers our whole brain, but really the lobes are again occipital, parietal, frontal, and temporal. So what does the frontal lobe do? Now the frontal lobe is basically the front of our brain, where our forehead is kind of situated, all right? Forehead area. The frontal lobe enables us to think, behave, and as well as have memory, to denote that. So frontal lobe, it allows us to think, it allows us to behave, and it gives us the ability to memorize things or to have memory. And that is also associated with the hippocampus as well. But frontal lobe, really what you need to know is that it allows us to think and to behave. But just keep in mind, frontal lobe thinking and behavior is key with the frontal lobe. Now, how about the occipital lobe? So the occipital lobe, I can bring an arrow, I guess, down all the way here. The occipital lobe gives us the function of visual reception. Visual reception. So the occipital lobe is of course located, since the frontal lobe is the forehead area, this is the back of our head, right? And again, as I mentioned, occipital lobe gives us that function to see things. It gives us the ability to have vision. So without our occipital lobe, we would not be seeing really anything. So again, occipital lobe gives us that function of visual reception. And then the parietal lobe, which is a little bit above the occipital lobe, as you can see. Parietal lobe gives us the function of sensory, mainly sensory. So really with the parietal lobe, which is of course located a little bit above the occipital, it gives us the ability to sense things really. So it gives us the ability to feel things, to have touch, to have reception through our senses. So parietal lobe is key in giving us the ability to feel, touch, and have sense. And then lastly, our temporal lobe, which is located a little bit below the frontal lobe, as you can see. The temporal lobe gives us the ability to learn, and that is really key. Learning is key with the temporal lobe. When you want to learn, when you want to also hear, and hearing capabilities. So temporal lobe gives us the ability to not only learn and to understand certain concepts, and gives us that ability to understand things again through learning, but it also gives us the ability to hear sounds, to perceive sounds. All are associated with the temporal lobe. So quick recap here. Forehead, the frontal lobe is the very front of our brain, right? Temporal lobe is a little bit below that, but frontal lobe gives us essentially the ability to think, give us the ability to behave, and also the ability to have memory. Temporal lobe gives us the ability to learn, to understand things as we're learning things, and also to hear, to have the perception of hearing sounds and listening to things And then the parietal lobe gave us the ability to sense things, to have touch, the feeling of touch. And then occipital lobe really is about visual reception. If we didn't have the occipital lobe, of course, think of it as we would not be seeing things at all. So visual reception is with the occipital lobe. If you have any questions, if you want to reach out to me, feel free to do so. But I hope you guys, of course, enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. But stay tuned for future psychology videos. And until then, I will see you guys in the next one.